Welcome to another episode of the Impact of AI and Data. Each episode explores how data and big data and artificial intelligence impacts us both daily and professionally, which we will discover more with our guest today. This week's episode is sponsored by WILDA, Women Leaders in Data and Artificial Intelligence. Our guest is Michelle Dunivan. Michelle Dunivan has recently accepted a job as Analytics Director for Best Friends Animal Society. And what I find fascinating is we always talk about how data is, supporting carbon footprint or how data is being redeveloped within an organization. But talking to you, Michelle, today and understanding how you are transforming how we look at animal society, animal welfare, both internally and externally, I think is going to be a fantastic conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
So let's just dive right into your job. What is an analytics director?
I am responsible for data acquisition, the data visualization, more advanced analytics, as well as a research team right now. So we kind of cover the wide range of small data, big data, everything in between.
So I'm just going to clarify because I know some organizations, they split out data and analytics, but it sounds like your role encompasses both, where you're collecting the data and getting it cleansed and formatting and labeling, and then finally going into the analytics stage, which you talked about the visualization. Is all of that still in your purview as well?
We do have a data director, and she's incredible and works a lot with, the more technical side of getting our Snowflake environment set up just right and making sure that all of the technical pieces are aligned. But we work very, very closely together. So our team does do some things that are more traditionally on the data side of things. Her team helps out with some things that are more traditionally on the analytics side of things. And so, yeah, there's a lot of collaboration going on between the two, but we do have a huge focus on the data specific pieces of this as well.
Let's start with something you mentioned a moment ago, a research team. I don't think I would have expected to hear the Best Friends Animal Society have a research team. What type of activities does this team do, and how's that creating value to your organization?
Absolutely. It's one of the most exciting things that I feel really fortunate to be able to bring into this role. Having started in academia, that's all we do is research, and it translates very well into the data and analytics space because we are figuring out how to quantify really fuzzy things and how to say definitively, is there a difference between these two things? Is there an association between these two things? Is this causal? Is this correlated? And I think the dream is to be able to do that without necessarily having to jump through all the hoops of a publication, right? Sometimes you know that this is the answer, but does it matter if it gets published, if it actually gets used? And that's a lot of times that struggle in academia is, okay, I'm making sure that this gets published, but are the people who need to see it most, are they going to have the opportunity to see it? And what's great about this role is we get to design the studies that are going to help us make decisions in the future and are going to be most actionable, because we've decided that they are important to help us achieve our goals. And then we do, the organization as a whole is very data driven and very willing to let the data guide where we go next. And so the research team, right now, it's a 3-person team, and they have experience. It's interesting. One of them is very dog focused, and another is very cat focused, and the other one is more industry focused. And so we do a lot of studies on animal behavior, and we actually have an animal behaviorist on staff with a PhD and advanced credentials that looks into what kind of behavior programs are going to keep animals alive the longest, right? If we can educate different shelters about why animals are behaving a certain way or how to modify behaviors, can we keep them from being killed or euthanized for behavior-related purposes and reasons? So that's one area of focus. And then on the cat side, we look a lot around community cat programs. So you might have stray cats or feral cats, but we call them community cats because they are often part of a community.
Hmm.
And they oftentimes have people who are caring for them. And so our research is really to go into some of those things about just how many people are already caring for these cats. What is the harm in having them stay outside? Do they need to be in a home? Do they need to have one specific person who is assigned to caring for them? Or can a whole community really care for cats? Are there really, there's a lot of myths around animals and animal welfare. And this group really helps to address some of those things. One of the biggest things that I think is really interesting and has been in the news a lot is this concept of pandemic puppies and the pandemic puppies being returned. We, there's a lot of really reputable sources that are saying, oh, everybody got all of these puppies during the pandemic, and then they're returning them because they realize, they're having to go back into the office. And we have all of the data, and we can refute that narrative all together. The question wasn't, what our data shows is that animals were not being adopted at higher rates. The difference was that shelters weren't open to accept as many animals, and so the shelters were closing, or they were being emptied for a brief period of time, but not because everybody was adopting, but because they weren't taking in as many animals. There weren't as many opportunities to take in animals, and we are not seeing evidence that there are more owner surrenders as a result of those adoptions than at any other time that we've been collecting data, which has been really thorough since 2016.
All right, so this might be a silly analogy, but the supply and demand. I never thought about supply and demand looking at it from animals, but I equate this to recently trying to get a car, and the supply of new cars was not available. So I went through the used cars, and there wasn't a lot of supply, but high level demand. And does that kind of, like, if I relate to it a little bit, does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And we take that analogy and we apply it in a lot of different contexts. So because we have the most thorough and comprehensive data set for animals in shelters across the US, we can look at regionally which regions have an oversupply of an animal or an undersupply of an animal. And best friends, we can use that data so that we can help facilitate transportation from those overpopulated shelters that are about to maybe euthanize for space and move them into shelters that have capacity. And so that is a huge part of what we do. And that's all data driven.
Well, that's good. I was just about to ask, well, couldn't you just transfer them over to that's exactly the question. You just answered my own question.
Of course, there's always red tape because you're moving across state lines. So different states have different regulations and even laws around whether or not you can transport animals in, and if there's a holding period, and even some things like diseases that are completely manageable, if you're even allowed to bring an animal in with certain like ringworm, it's an issue, but it's a manageable issue. And so some of that is around that education and how you can navigate all of those different barriers that are very different from state to state.
You mentioned earlier that you really are a data-driven organization, but you also mentioned the goals of the Best Friends Animal Society. Do those goals change because you're following the data, or does the goals pretty much stay the same, and the data just, the decisions just kind of wrap around that?
That's such a great question, Melissa. We have one overarching goal right now, and that is to get to no more homeless pets and no animals being killed in the US by 2025. So that is our overarching goal. It is ambitious. We are just a few years away, but because we have that very clear goal, and it is data driven, right? We have to collect all of the data from all of the shelters to know whether or not we've gotten to no kill, and we need to identify which shelters are struggling the most. And so in the past, our strategies have been driven by data. So the goal stays the same and has been and will continue to be the same all the way through 2025 and perhaps beyond, because there's always maintenance after you reach it. You have to sustain it. But so strategy started out with which are the states that need the most help. And then as we got more and more granular data, which are the shelters that need the most help? And now that we've kind of gone through those iterations, we're adjusting and looking at which are the shelters that are most likely to, you just need that extra push to get from nearly no kill to no kill. And what kind of resources can we provide them? Because we were always looking at volume previously, which is important. We want to save as many animals as possible. But at some point, you realize there are different barriers in different states and in different shelters. And there's a lot of places that are looking for a little bit of guidance and assistance. And so how do you then, if we're looking to get every single shelter in the US to no kill,
Mm-hmm.
which ones are now the ones that, even though it might be a smaller volume that we're saving, that we create that sustainability so that this year, yeah, maybe we only made a difference in 2 or 3% or 4% or 7% of, you know, the animals, but over time that really adds up. And if we can get enough of those shelters, you know, it makes a big difference.
You know, initially I was going to ask how you're doing towards that goal, but then I stepped back and realized, you know, as a data, you know, if I put my data hat on, I can't really ask that question without coming back to the assumption of, are you really touching every shelter? Because you use the word shelter, but in my neighborhood, it's called the Animal Rescue Center.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know you're really touching everybody, that you're getting the information from everybody?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that is something that we work on a lot. So back in 2015, 2016, when we set out this goal, we went through a lot to define what is a shelter. What are we considering a shelter? So it's a brick and mortar building that houses animals in some capacity. There's a little, you know, there's more to it. There's more detail to it. We also look at volume, and we do include rescues if they fit that definition of taking in animals. And you know, they don't have to be a government organization. They can be municipal. They could have a contract with a municipality, or they could just be a private organization. And so we organize all of that. We collect all of that data, and we figure out where that is. And we do have the most comprehensive shelter list in the industry as well. So we know what shelters are out there, but it's constantly changing, especially during the pandemic. Shelters are no different than anything else. We had a lot that shuttered their doors. We had new ones that popped up. We had some that consolidated. So, and government contracts are changing on a regular basis. And so it is an ongoing effort to keep track of what our master shelter list is at any given time.
Which now allows me to ask my original question: how are you doing towards that goal, 2025?
We're doing really well. You know, there are so many goals within that goal. So one of our goals for the analytics team and the data team is to, how many shelters have we not yet collected data from? How can we get to them? How can we reach them? How can we incentivize them? How can we help them to understand how they can use this data to benefit them individually? So that's one of our goals, and we are doing really, really well towards that. Out of over 4,000 shelters in the US, we have, oh gosh, I wish I could give you an exact number, but it's just a little over 500 that we don't have data for at this point in time. And we collect that data in a lot of ways. So that's one piece of that goal, is having all of the data to be able to make this definitive statement. We've made a ton of progress since 2016. You know, we had almost 2 million animals being killed every year in 2016, and we are down to around 350,000 right now. So we're seeing huge gains, and we've been able to also track best friends engagement with the shelters, and to see what that engagement does compared to not engaging with best friends. And we can see a huge change over time with the shelters. There's a much bigger impact on the life-saving capacity in shelters that do partner with best friends compared to those that don't.
I recognize that technology, AI technologies, data, the ability to house this data, all of this has changed within the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
Which has given us the ability to access the data to answer some of the business challenges that you've highlighted. What are other business challenges that you see now that you're able to make an impact and be able to respond to, that probably wouldn't have been able to 5 years ago?
That's a great question. Well, one of our projects that isn't related to the animals, but it's related to all of the constituents that help best friends to be what we are and to be able to do what we do. So we have a huge army of volunteers that help us throughout the country. We have donors that make this possible. It wouldn't be possible for us to do any of this if we didn't have the money to go into shelters and say, we're going to help you with getting these vaccines. We're going to help you with, getting these programs in place and the education that's needed to really move this forward. We're going to give you stipends for spay-neuter clinics or whatever else it is. So there's all of those. There's also, we have action team members that are signing petitions for us and talking to their legislators to make sure that we can get those pet-friendly laws that make no-kill a possibility. And so being able to take all of that information, so what are the characteristics of all of those constituents and what kind of communication are we having with those constituents so that we can see how do we keep them engaged? I always think that Best Friends really has this subtext of another goal, which is to make sure that everybody who wants to have a part in no more homeless pets and no more killing of cats and dogs across the US, anybody who wants to be part of that can find a way to be a part of that. And so it really helps us to navigate how do we make sure that the people who want to be involved in this goal and in this mission, how do we make sure that they can? What are the best ways for us to communicate with them to make it accessible and easy and open? And data is giving us those insights to make sure that we're not closing the door on anybody who wants to be part of this.
So I know the scope of this conversation is about data, but if I think of data as a very tactical component, everything that I hear from you today is not looking at data as a tactical, but really seeing data strategic and more transformative. Would that be a correct assumption?
It is, yeah. Best Friends is transforming the animal welfare industry, and data is transforming Best Friends. So it's really, they are very, very interlinked. There's no way to disentangle them. If we looked at, I've been reading and discussing a lot about data monetization lately. And so what is the value of our data? This is an asset for us. And I can't even imagine where we would start because everything at Best Friends is so reliant on the data that we have available to us to make sure that we are not, that even though we are acting with our hearts and our souls, we are also making sure that we are that we also are balancing that with the logical and the rational piece of what is truly happening out there, not just our impressions, not just what the loudest voice in the room has to say, but what are the numbers telling us.
Is there any particular project that you've had in the last year that you're particularly fond of and would like to share?
Well, we do have a really big project that we are about to launch, and that is going to, well, let me take a step back and just say that we, as a nonprofit, are connected with many, many other nonprofits in the animal welfare space. We love to make sure that they have any resources that they need to help animals, and that we can collaborate when they have something, that we can really use and that we know that our partners and that shelters across the US could benefit from. So one of those projects that we're working on is figuring out how to accept all of this data in an easier manner for the customers, for the clients, the people who are providing us this data, to make it as simple and easy for them as possible, and to get more detailed data for us so that we can give even clearer insights about exactly where the help is most needed and where we're succeeding the most and which programs are succeeding the most. And so this is working with industry partners to get some real-time data and to accept it directly from the shelter management softwares into our data set, and to be able to turn that around and help shelters to be transparent with their data, and then help us to help any other adventure that we need in order to make that available. So that's been more of a software development product that we're doing, but it's very, very data. Everything is about the data product piece of it. So that is something that is, again, going to transform the industry as a whole, to have that information. And we were talking earlier about that supply chain, and it really speaks to that. Right now, what we have as an industry, like I said, we have the best data set that is out there, and we get it monthly or annually right now. And so it's very reactive, but this is going to give us the opportunity to be proactive and prevent killing, as opposed to having to just measure like, oh, well, they had a bad month last month, so maybe they're going to still have a bad month next month. This is going to help us to say, oh, you've got 2 standard deviations above the mean of intakes this month, so we should probably go ahead and reach out to you and see if you need any help with transports, and help us to just be that active partner.
So that's how you're able to shift away from a more tactical, and I like the fact that you use the word reactive, into something about being able to take that data and become more proactive in not only making those decisions, but in order to understand who to help out and reach to proactively, not, oh, by the way, after the fact, you could have done X or we could have helped you do Y. Right.
Right.
Awesome. If I think about this forward, so forward thinking future, um, what would you like to know that hopefully in the future your data can help you address? Like, what are the nice to haves? Or as you've been in your job, you're like, oh, God, I wish we could answer this. We're not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually been setting up some brainstorming sessions with our executive leadership to say what questions would help us get to 2025 the most, and kind of passing those off to mostly our research team, but really making sure that if we already have the data, let's go ahead and answer those questions, or if it only takes us a little bit more. So yeah, we've been having those discussions. What do we want to answer next? And I think we're really getting into the psychology of our communities and saying, what is the resistance to community cats? We know there's a resistance in some communities. Why? Why is it there? Or we understand that it can be harder to adopt large dogs. Why is it? Are there housing restrictions? You can't have an animal over a certain size in your apartment. Is it that there are myths about certain breeds' behaviors that that haven't been debunked adequately? Why are these happening? Not are they happening? We already have those answers. We've already done that research, but it's more about the psychology behind it, and what we can do to address some of those deficiencies in our own communication. So that's one piece of it. But another one is really understanding that whole flow of intake, length of stay, breed, age, all the way to the type of outcome, and understanding, okay, if an animal comes in maybe this time of year with these characteristics, what's the most likely outcome for that animal in that environment, so that we can also, again, preempt some killing and find the resources that are needed so that we can help and save those animals the most. Right now we have a lot of aggregated data, but that animal level data is going to help us to understand what's really happening in that supply and demand that's happening. We're hearing a lot, especially through the pandemic, about well, I had to go to a breeder because there just weren't puppies available that I wanted. And so right now, the animal welfare sphere supplies about 35% of the animals that are out there. So it's not like every single animal we're expecting to come from a shelter, but at the same time, there are animals that are dying and we would like them to not die, as opposed to breeding and or getting an animal from a breeder. So how do we make those connections, and how do we find out what that supply and demand is, so that we could maybe on an even more individualized basis understand what's out there, so that we could match to transport opportunities or even individual adopters.
You mentioned the word community cat a few times during our conversation, and I want to go back and just clarify. I'm going to give you an example. My family and I were driving down the road, and we were coming across a train crossing, and there was a big box, almost like what we thought at first was a homeless shelter, but there was a big sign on it that said, "Don't touch. The community is feeding these kittens. Just leave them alone." And I never thought of well, first I had never seen that before, where you just leave the bundle of kittens where they were, and then you've got the community over there feeding them and giving them water. But when you talk about community cats, I'm thinking differently, that it's abandoned cats that were then brought in to a shelter or a rescue center. Am I
It's
understanding that
complicated.
correctly? Yeah,
It's
well, that's what,
complicated.
yeah.
So for many years, we had a situation where 2 cats were being killed for every 1 dog. And the question is, if they're not being adopted out, how do we save their lives? And we know that we need to control that population. So there is a need for spay and neuter. There's a need for vaccination. And so what we've been trying to do is identify, okay, if these are cats that are being taken care of, they are not vulnerable, they are not at risk, they are actually thriving as outdoor cats in a community. How do we make sure that they get spayed or neutered, they get vaccinated, and then they can go back to the community? And a lot of people don't like that. They don't want, there's a lot of ideas that are out there that mostly have been debunked by research, but maybe haven't been communicated, sufficiently, so that everybody understands that community cats are not a burden, but they can be a benefit, and there are humans that really love caring for these animals. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that so if you were to take all of these strays and take them into the shelter, they're likely to die. That is a death sentence for many of them. And so instead, what are the opportunities to kind of go around that system or change the system and see how that works and see what the impact is? So it's I think that, I hope that answers your question. And
yeah, it does. I never, your solution, which I don't think I had thought of, was it's okay for them to stay in the community, but we should be able to offer them spay and neutering services, and then, bring them back to the community, which is not just supporting the animals, but it sounds like what you were talking about, the psychological effect. There's people out there caring for them that are getting something out of this.
Right. Okay. Right.
Oh. As we look to wrap up today, do you have any last minute thoughts that you'd like to share?
I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's helped me to highlight some of the things that I love most about my job. I really love the research component of it that it isn't typically part of a data and analytics team, but is, I think, really imperative to getting those answers using data in a different fashion. I also just really appreciate the opportunity to communicate about what we're doing and what data and analytics has the capability of transforming an industry and the US really as a whole. I think that it's something that's really exciting. And I think data and analytics professionals aren't always good at communicating our great points. And so I really appreciate you giving us a platform to be able to do that.
What I find most, that always makes me smile is anyone who's working with data. Majority of the population sees Excel spreadsheets and numbers and, oh my gosh, just a lot of busy little things that are on the screen. But when I talk to folks that are behind the scenes doing this job, they're always smiling. They have a passion about what they're doing that comes through. And you're definitely, absolutely, I can see that. We're on the YouTube. I'm sure everybody will be able to hear that if they can hear you smiling, when you speak about it. And thank you for being a guest on the show.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.